Who is Jesus? I have no idea who Jesus is.
I don't know if it exists, but I believe in him.
I think it's a person who lived ages ago.
Who is Jesus? He is the Son of God in the Christian faith.
Jesus for me is also a prophet. He probably was just some fella who walked around with a beard and and a bottle of wine in his back pocket and switched the water with the wine a couple of times, and everyone loved him.
Jesus to me is somebody we got taught about in infants and junior school, really.
There's how many million people celebrating his birthday. No one celebrates my birthday like that, so surely he must have existed.
Jesus is my God.
He's someone that, you know, I can relate to, I can pray to, I can talk to.
The Son of God, but apparently we are all God's children, so then what is so great about Jesus?
I come from a family of lawyers. I practiced as a barrister for a number of years. My father was a barrister, my mother was a barrister, my sister is a barrister, my son qualified as a barrister, my daughter qualified as a barrister, my grandfathers on both sides were barristers, my uncle was a barrister. If we'd had a cat, it would have been a barrister. But I didn't come from a Christian background. I wasn't brought up as a Christian. I was brought up as a barrister, not a Christian. And my father was a Holocaust survivor. Many of his family had perished in concentration camps. He was Jewish, a secular Jew. He would have described himself as an agnostic. My mother was not a churchgoer, and so I didn't have any kind of Christian upbringing. But I kind of did my own investigations, and I just into the philosophy of life, and I came to the conclusion that I was an atheist. And I was quite a vociferous atheist. I wasn't kind of proselytizing. I didn't think that other people had to be atheists. I didn't go around trying to convert other people to atheism. But if anyone tried to convert me, then I had quite a lot to say on the subject. And I was quite argumentative. And I didn't really like Christians. I was very suspicious of Christians. I'd come across one or two of them in my gap year between school and university, and I was deeply suspicious of them. They had these kind of smiles that were a bit odd, really. Why were they smiling like that? It seemed like a bit cult-like. And so I avoided them, and I was sharing rooms with, I had a room next door to my great friend Nicky Lee, who we'd been at school together, and we ended up in rooms next door to each other at university. And I said to him, Nicky, whatever you do, don't let those Christians into your room. They are dangerous. But unbeknown to me, he had been thinking about it quite seriously, and one evening he and his then girlfriend, now his wife Scylla, came back and they told me that they had become Christians. I was devastated. I mean, they were such lovely people. I thought, what can I do? I've got to help them. I don't know anything about this. I better investigate. It was late at night. I thought, what can I read? So I went to my bookshelf and I found I had this old Bible that I'd had for RE at school. And that night I started reading it. I started reading Matthew's Gospel. So at the beginning of the New Testament, I just read Matthew, Mark, Luke. About halfway through John's Gospel, 3 o'clock in the morning, I fell asleep. Following morning, I carried on reading. I read all of that day, all of the next day, all of the next day. I was a student. I didn't have any work to do. And by the time I had completed the New Testament, I came to the conclusion, it's true. I didn't want to be a Christian, but I came to the conclusion, it's true. Why? What evidence is there for Christianity? You can't prove Christianity mathematically. You can't prove it scientifically. Science, of course, is very, very important, but science answers different questions to faith. Science answers the questions, when and how did this world come into being? What it can't answer is the question, who and why. let me use a visual aid. I've got here a cake. Now, this cake, supposing we sent this cake off to the top scientists in the world, they would be able to tell you, possibly, what the ingredients were that were put into this cake. They might be able to tell you how it was made. They might even be able to work out when it was made. But they wouldn't be able to tell you who made it and why it was made. Actually, the answer is, I made this cake. It's a very nice cake. It's not... to be honest, I had a bit of help from Pippa, but it's still a bit of a mess. But it's only me who can tell you why I made it. The reason I made it was for this visual aid. And also for my small group to eat at the end of the evening. But only the Creator can tell you who made it and why. So, that's, if you like, the difference between science and faith. Science is very important because it deals with the scientific questions, but equally faith is really important because it answers some very fundamental questions about life. And everyone has faith. An atheist has faith that there is no God. You can't prove that mathematically or scientifically. And those of us who believe in Jesus do so on the basis of evidence. I myself could not be a Christian if it was kind of like a blind leap of faith. There was no evidence at all, you just had to believe. I believe there is good historical evidence. Historical evidence is evidence. Scientific evidence is not the only kind of evidence. As a lawyer, we used what you might call historical evidence. Every time a jury brings back a verdict, they're doing it on the basis of things that happened in history. Evidence of history. And every jury decision is a step of faith. And so it is that we have to make up our minds about Jesus. And that is a step of faith. I came to believe in God because of Jesus. It seems to me that the resurrection of Jesus, which I came to believe in, and we'll come back to this, strongly suggests that this world has a creator, and that that creator is to be seen in terms of through the lens of Jesus. And to me it makes a lot of sense, because if there's a God, and God wanted to reveal himself, you can't get to know someone unless they reveal himself. No one can get to know you unless you reveal yourself. And if God wanted to reveal himself to us, what would be the best way to do that? It seems to me to be logical that he would reveal himself in a way that we could understand, in a human being like us. So, what is the evidence? First of all, what is the evidence that Jesus even existed? Some people say, well, maybe Jesus didn't even exist, but there's overwhelming historical evidence. No serious historian would suggest that Jesus didn't exist. We know from evidence outside of the New Testament that Jesus existed, from historians like Tacitus and Suetonius. The first century Jewish historian, Josephus, said this, or wrote this about Jesus. He said, there was about this time Jesus, a doer of wonderful works. And he then goes on to talk about the crucifixion of Jesus and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament, but most of our evidence comes from inside the New Testament. Now, of course, the New Testament was written a long time ago. And people say, how do we know that what we have here hasn't been changed over the years? And the answer is we do know through a science called textual criticism. Essentially, the way textual criticism works is like this. the more manuscripts that you have, and the earlier they are, the more you can be sure about what the original said. Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. Earliest copies we have are 900 AD, so there's a 1300-year gap, and we have only 8 copies of each. Yet no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. Livy's Roman History, 900-year gap, 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950-year gap, 9 to 10 copies. Tacitus, 1,000-year gap, 20 copies. Then we come to the New Testament, written between 40 and 100 AD. Earliest manuscript, AD 130. 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin, 9,300 others. Totally unique amongst ancient prose writings. So one of the greatest ever textual critics, F.J.A. Hort, said this: "In the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings." And no secular historian would disagree with that. So we know from evidence outside and inside the New Testament that Jesus existed. But who is he? We know he was fully human. He had a body, emotions, experiences. But many today would say, yes, he was a human being. We know he existed. Maybe he was a great human being. Maybe he was a great religious teacher. But no more than that. To suggest he was the Son of God, to suggest he was God, that's going too far. So there are 2 parts to this argument. First part of the argument is, what did Jesus think about himself? Because if Jesus didn't think that he was God, that's kind of the end of the argument. And even if he did, the second part of the argument is, was he right? So what did Jesus say about himself? The first bit of evidence here is that Jesus' teaching was centered on himself. Great religious teachers point away from themselves. They say, don't look at me, look at God. Jesus, who personified humility, said, look at me, come to me. This question of ultimate meaning and purpose. What is our life about? This sort of sense of what you might call a spiritual hunger. This sense that other things don't quite satisfy. However good these things are, there's always this slight void, this sense something is missing. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. If you want that hunger satisfied, come to me. The stuff in our lives that we don't like. I have stuff in my life I don't like. I have things that, the habits that I find quite addictive. Jesus said, if the Son sets you free, if I set you free, you really will be free. Then there's all the stuff we carry around. Worry, anxiety, fear, guilt. Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. If you want peace of mind, come to me. He said, if you receive me, you receive God. If you welcome me, you welcome God. He said, if you have seen me, you have seen God. A little child was drawing a picture of God in the class one time. The teacher said, well, what are you doing? He said, I'm drawing a picture of God. Jesus said, what do you mean? You can't draw a picture of God. Nobody knows what God looks like. So I said, well, they will do in a minute. Jesus said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. If you've seen me, you've seen God. And then there were his indirect claims. Jesus claimed to be able to forgive sins. He went up to people and said, your sins are forgiven. Of course, if someone offends you, you can forgive them. But you can't go up to some random person and say, your sins are forgiven. When Jesus did that, the lawyers said, who can forgive sins but God alone? Forgiveness is at the heart of what Jesus came to do, to make forgiveness possible. It's at the heart of Christianity. C.S. Lewis says that a Christian is someone who forgives the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in us. And then there were his direct claims. There's so many of them, but we haven't got time to look at them all, but I'd love us to just look at one. If you have a Bible there, you might like to turn to it. John chapter 10, verse 30 to 33. Jesus said this, I and the Father are one. A claim tantamount to a claim to be God was blasphemy in the eyes of the people at the time, and they picked up stones to stone him. Jesus said, I've shown you many great miracles from the Father. From which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. I think if you look at all the evidence, it's clear that Jesus did make that claim. It's an astonishing claim. But of course, a claim like that needs to be tested. And really, if you think about it, there are only really three possibilities. Either it was not true, and Jesus knew perfectly well it was not true, in which case he was a fraudster. Or else it was not true, and he just simply didn't realize it was not true. He genuinely thought he was God, in which case he was deluded, or we would say insane. But logically, there is only really one other possibility, and that is that it's true. C.S. Lewis, one of the intellectual giants of the 20th century, and of course best known as the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, said this, a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else insane or something worse. But let's not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So, second part of the argument. Was he right in what he said about himself? What's the evidence to support his claims? Here's the first piece of evidence, his teaching. The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching of all time. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to other people as you would have them do to you. And then this, totally revolutionary. The first person to say this. Love your enemy. Jesus' teaching has been the foundation of our entire civilization in the West. Many of our laws were originally founded on the teaching of Jesus. We've advanced in every field of science and technology. Think how much we've advanced in the last 10 years in science and technology. Yet in 2,000 years, no one has ever improved on the moral teaching of Jesus. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the kind of words you'd expect God to speak. So the first piece of evidence is teaching. Secondly, his life, what he did. I thought Christianity was boring. I thought Jesus would be a bore. I thought Jesus would be the kind of person who would turn wine into water. I was amazed to read of Jesus going to a party. It would have been such fun to be with Jesus. Went to a party, the wine ran out. He said, go and get those jars, fill them with bath water, and start pouring it out for the guests. And they started pouring it out. And out came Chateau Lafite 45. BC, that is. Not just his miracles, but his love for the marginalized, feeding the hungry, healing the sick, and ultimately laying down his life for us. Jesus said, greater love has no one than this, than lay down his life for his friends. And then his character has impressed millions of people who wouldn't call themselves Christians. Time magazine described Jesus as the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of humanity. His enemies could find no fault. And his friends, who knew him really well, said, this guy's without sin. I often think the real test of character is when we're under pressure. And Jesus, when he was being tortured, said about his torturers, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And then his fulfillment of prophecy. No one else in the history of the world has had a whole collection of books written about them before they were born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 prophecies, 29 of them in a single day. Well, you might say, maybe he got hold of the Old Testament, he read all these prophecies, and he thought, right, I better go around fulfilling all of these. The problem about that is the sheer number of them, and humanly speaking, he had no control. The exact manner of his death was prophesied. The place of his burial, his resurrection. Even the place of his birth was prophesied. Reading through, oh, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem. It's too late. And then his conquest of death. This is the cornerstone of Christianity. It's so relevant to every single person here. Because, statistically speaking, 1 in 1 die. There was a headline in The Onion, the satirical magazine, world death rate holding steady at 100%. That's the reality. You know, the Victorians used to talk about a lot about death, but they never talked about sex. We talk a lot about sex, but we don't talk about death. It's kind of just something you don't mention. Even in hospitals now, they try to avoid using the word death. Heard of one hospital where they said you must never use the word death. They had a politically correct way of describing it. Negative patient care outcome. But people die nevertheless. And when you go to a funeral and the coffin goes into the ground, it looks absolutely final. And it is. Unless death has been conquered. Unless, when Jesus died and was buried, he was raised to life. If he was, then there's hope beyond this life. But is it just wishful thinking? It is, unless there's evidence. What is the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? First of all, his absence from the tomb. No one has ever satisfactorily explained why Jesus' body was not there the first Easter day. People have come up with all that sort of explanation. The authorities stole the body. Well, in that case, why didn't they produce it when everyone was saying that Jesus had been seen? They couldn't. I find this piece of evidence fascinating. That when the disciples heard that Jesus had been raised from the dead, they ran to the tomb. And when they got to the tomb, they looked in, and what they found was the grave clothes of Jesus were still there. The only valuable thing for a robber to steal was still there. And they'd collapsed like a caterpillar's cocoon when the butterflies emerge. And the piece that had been around his head had been folded up and put in another place. And it says when they saw that, they believed. So not only his absence from the tomb, then his presence with the disciples. Jesus was seen on several occasions. On one occasion, by more than 500 people. That's probably the number of people downstairs here in the church tonight. All saw him on the same occasion. People say hallucination. Hallucination does occur amongst highly strung, highly imaginative, very nervous people or people who are sick or on drugs. The disciples don't fit any of those categories. They were cynics like Thomas. They were tough fishermen. They were tax collectors. Tax collectors do not hallucinate. And then there was the transformation of the disciples. Here was a group of people depressed, disillusioned, and suddenly they're going around saying, "We've seen Jesus. He really is alive." I have a friend who's a scientist at Cambridge called Ian Walker, and he said, when he looked at what happened to the disciples, most of them died pretty horrific deaths as a result of their beliefs. They were crucified, they were beheaded, they were tortured. And all they had to say was, no, actually, it's not true. We didn't really see him. But they didn't. And he said he became convinced that those people would not have died for something they would have known was not true. But they knew it was true because they'd seen the risen Jesus. And as a result, this movement swept. It's a movement without precedent in the history of the world. It swept the whole known world. And it has no parallel. And it's still happening. You know, there are 2,300 million Christians in the world today, of every ethnicity, every continent, every nationality, every economic, social, and intellectual background. They all speak of this encounter with the risen Jesus. So when we look at what Jesus claimed about himself, the first part of the argument, I think it's clear that Jesus did claim to be a man whose identity was God. Was he deluded? Was he a fraud? When I look at the evidence of his teaching, his things that he did, his character, his fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection, it seems to me absurd, illogical, unbelievable to say he was insane or a fraud. On the other hand, it provides the strongest possible supporting evidence that what Jesus said about himself was true. And that's how I came to the conclusion it's true. But it's one thing to believe it here. And for me, I tried to put it off because I wasn't keen on the implications of it being true for my life. I thought I could put it off to my deathbed, maybe. But then I sort of thought that wouldn't be intellectually honest. So I basically said, okay, yes. And at that moment, I experienced in my heart a real encounter with Jesus, which changed my life in a very radical way. And I experienced that rather than it being some kind of terrible thing that was going to happen, that when Jesus said, "I've come that you might have life and have it in all its fullness," that's what I've experienced for the last 40 years. Of course, it's not always easy. Of course, there are ups and downs. Of course, I mess up. But I've found that it really is true. Jesus really is who he claimed to be. Jesus really did rise from the dead. There really is hope beyond this life. And this encounter totally changed my life.